Welcome everyone. Please raise your hand if you're here for the first time. If you're at BDD London meetups for the first time. Welcome. That is so amazing to see that many hands up. So, if you don't know, BDD London meetups started as a BHAT meetups, which is like a PHP Cucumber implementation. We quickly outgrew both BHAT and PHP, the testing tools in general, because we started to have too many talks which were generally related to behavior-driven development more than they were related to testing, automation, Cucumber, or BHAT. And we were interested to have all those conversations. And even if it is technical conversation outside of the PHP community in a Java or a JavaScript, we want to hear those things, right? So please, if you have things to share, if you're working on the BDD-related project, or you're doing BDD at your own pace with your clients, or like maybe with your own company, your own project, please submit some talks, share your experiences. We have BDD meetups every 2 months, so there's plenty of time for us to learn from your experience and for you to prepare for it. If you need any help in preparation, just email to the organizers of the BDD meetup on themeetup.com. We are always available to help here. Now, the interesting thing about the BDD is that even though the thing was here for quite some time, there's plenty of people that do understand BDD and do deeply care about the principles of behavior-driven development and apply it in day-to-day life. There's not that many books written about BDD. And I think the reason for that is that to understand a thing just requires a very high level of appreciation and experience. To be able to write this experience down in a book requires a whole different level. It requires ability to write in words and express in simple sentences things that usually take me a paragraph of text or like a couple of hours of back and forth explanations with the clients. Because of that, I'm very, very happy to have John Ferguson Smart to speak here, one of the authors of the great books about around BDD, BDD in Action. And as a matter of fact, John offers a couple of books to give away or 1 hour of his time to spend talking about BDD. Today at midnight, right, John? At midnight, there will be a website published where you can enter the raffle, and somewhere tomorrow-ish...
The website's already online, but the draw happens at midnight.
Draw will happen at midnight, and somewhere tomorrow-ish, you will know that you won one of the books, or an hour with John. Without further ado, John, please come in. Thank you.
Love you, John.
Shut up, Marco. So, great, it works. I'll skip the introduction. I write books, I do talks, I help organisations get their act together to deliver better software. You can read about that in the brief, but I really want to talk about BDD tonight, so I'll move on to the interesting stuff fairly quickly. So the draw that Constantine was talking about is here. You are allowed to take out your telephones and enter that particular URL and enter your names and emails and all that shit, and go into the draw. It will be drawn out at midnight for technical reasons, and tomorrow I will make sure post the results on the meetup site. So I'll just give everyone a moment to take that in. And it will be open until midnight. If you don't get a chance, if you've got crappy network connections at the moment, don't worry, you can do it after the talk, or you can do it now. Are we all good? So, behaviour-driven development. I was kind of hoping that I was coming to this meeting called the BDD London meetup, and I said, oh, these guys are on top of it. I'm coming to the mecca of BDD. I do not need to talk about the basics of BDD at all. Yeah? Everyone's sort of mastered it totally, and I'm sort of saying, here is my humble appreciation of what I think BDD is. But feel free to correct me. So I'm going to skip all the basics. Except I might add a couple of words just on my view of what behaviour-driven development is. So in a nutshell, this is what I think BDD is about. BDD is not a testing tool, it's not an automation tool. BDD is not BHAT or SpecFlow or Cucumber or JBehave. BDD is not what the testers do to get the test automated in a funky reporting manner. BDD is about collaboration. It's a collaboration, it's about having a conversation to discover requirements, to progressively and incrementally discover how to provide value to your organisation. Yeah, but we're doing that for years, yeah? We've been doing requirements, definition. I remember back in the 90s, we would spend 3 months writing up requirements definitions, and then it wouldn't work. We go, bugger, we need to spend more time. So we spent 6 months writing requirements. Still didn't work. So bugger, we'll have to do it better next time. Next time we'll get it right. We'll spend 12 months writing the requirements, and this time surely we'll get it right. No, it didn't really work that way. So one thing that this idea of behaviour-driven development brings to the table very nicely is the idea that rather than using abstract specifications and abstract ideas, the human brain works in a way, is trained, has evolved to receive stories and concrete examples much more receptively than abstract ideas, unless you're Socrates. We are trained from tribal times to receive stories, to understand how to take lessons, transmit lessons from generation to generation using stories. And stories are effectively concrete examples. So in BDD, what we do is rather than using abstract specifications, abstract requirement definitions, we try and think in terms of concrete examples. And we also try and use a common vocabulary, so a vocabulary that spans the gap between your business, your SMEs, your developers, your testers. Everyone is talking the same language. That's really important as well. So that's something that comes from domain-driven development. And the idea of using a common language is that it's actually a proxy for building up a shared understanding, and the shared understanding is what you're trying to do. BDD is all about getting a shared understanding, that's all, and accelerating your feedback loop. So if you have a shared understanding, if everyone understands what you're trying to do, and you've got a very fast feedback loop, you know whether you do something correctly or not, screw it, you don't need BDD, you're already good. You're probably working by yourself. And the end game is to build software that matters, to build software that actually delights the customer, to build software that makes a difference. So one of the big factors in BDD is trying to understand where the value comes from. So what is the value proposition of any feature? Understand why you're building something. And make sure everyone in the team understands why you're building something. So without further ado, let's get into the detailed material. I'm going to start with a much underappreciated classic book in the world of software development. Now this book is a very profound text on the philosophy behind requirements discovery. It tells the story of a user, Mr. Dog, who has some requirements, needs a new hat. And so he goes to a store and he asks for a new hat. But his problem is that the hats aren't quite right. So he tries one hat, it's too big, another one's too small, another one's too flat, one's too tall, and so forth. So he keeps trying and trying until he ends up trying all the hats in the store. And be careful, this is a bit of a cliffhanger ending. And he ends up finding the hat that suits him, or it's the hat that he came in with. Now, the point of this story from a software development perspective is not how to choose a good hat or not to stick with the old hat or a B hat. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So the point of this story is that finding requirements or finding a feature that suits you, that matches your needs, is often a question of balance. And that's also true of finding or implementing a practice, whether it be some agile practice, a BDD practice, or any other development practice. Often it's a question of balance. If you go to one extreme, you'll find things that aren't pushing you in the right direction. So you go to another extreme, you find countermeasures that are stopping you achieving what you're trying to do. It's always a question of balance. And the interesting thing is that balance is not a static thing. I can't give you a book to say, here is the well, I did, sort of. I can't give you a book that says, here is the definitive guide for how to implement BDD in your organisation. You have to, the way you implement BDD is as a journey. It's evolutionary. You start with a particular understanding of BDD and implementation, and as your team grows in their understanding, grows in their appreciation of BDD, grows in their synergy and how well they understand each other, how well they work together, how they can communicate between themselves, you can dispense with certain protocols, you can change the way you work, you can take shortcuts, which you couldn't have taken at the start of your project or at the start of your journey. So it's not a static thing. It's all about balance. It's all about getting the right balance and keeping that balance along the way, and then adjusting your progress, adjusting your practices to find the right balance as you go. So I've put together some what I call anti-patterns, and they're really practices that I see in a lot of organisations when I come in and help them out starting off with BDD or maturing their BDD or fixing their BDD. I see a lot of this, and it's quite common, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's often it's on the path to understanding how to do BDD well. And so I've collected a set of these anti-patterns, and I've grouped, what I found is they fall into three basic categories. Your first category is to do with who and when. So you're either doing things too early, you're doing things too late, or you're doing things with the wrong people, or not with the right people, or with the certain people missing that you should have involved. If you don't get that right, it's very hard to get the rest right. So that's really fundamental. The next level is the what. So are you focusing on building the right thing? So we say BDD is about, or software development in general, there's only two problems. One is building it right, and the other is building the right thing. So this is are you building the right thing? Is the software that you're developing worth building? Which is a minorly important question. And then the third level is how. How are you implementing the practices? Can you fine-tune the way you're delivering your software, or you're automating your tests, or you're understanding your requirements? Can you fine-tune that so that it's more efficient? So the rest of the talk is basically going through some of these patterns. And the first of these patterns is what I'd like to call the out to lunch pattern. Who here has trouble getting access to their stakeholders, their subject matter experts? I find a really effective approach is you put a cage suspended from the roof, and when they walk through the corridor, you... But that can be a problem. But stakeholder involvement is really important, and the thing here is you can't use the excuse of, oh, our stakeholders are too busy. Our business people are too busy to work with us, so we can't do a good job. That doesn't really cut it. At the end of the day, it's your responsibility to actually go and get them engaged. And that's really important. You need to be able to engage your stakeholders so that they actually want to talk to you and want to get involved in the project. Otherwise, how can you be sure that what you're building is actually interesting? Are you just mucking around with software development just for the heck of it and then maybe it'll be useful? Or are you actually trying to build something that will serve some useful purpose? And one way I like to think of it is in terms of a simple graph. On one axis, I put how often are you giving feedback. So we've talked about feedback. Feedback is a vitally important part of BDD, but I'm talking about all sorts of feedback. Feedback could be demonstrations. Feedback could be updates on what software, what features have been released. Ideally, you go to have part of your living documentation published so that in a way that the users can actually see it and see what software is being released. Feedback works best when you have multiple channels. It's like teaching. When you're trying to teach a concept, you present the concept from different angles to help it enter into people's brains, basically. Feedback's the same. You want multiple channels of feedback. On the other axis, we have how are you communicating with the business? Are you communicating in technical terms? Or are you communicating in more business language? Now, when you take these two things together, if you give no feedback or little feedback and the only feedback you give is technical, the business is going to be disengaged because they won't understand what they see and they won't see it very often, so they won't really care what you do. So you can't really blame them for not being engaged. Yeah? If, on the other hand, your feedback is technical, you give lots of feedback very frequently, but it's too technical. You'll just blow their minds because you'll drown them in information. There'll be too much information for them to absorb, and it'll be too technical and not interesting, so they'll just tune out. And you can't get any useful information out from a frazzled stakeholder. So don't frazzle your stakeholders. If, on the other hand, you move up the scale on the communication focus and you have really good business-focused communication, starts off really well, you have some nice living documentation, but then you don't actually keep it up and you don't give them regular feedback, they'll just tune out as well because they'll say, oh yeah, nothing's happening, forget it. And this is what I call jaded. Can't get much out of a jaded stakeholder either. So what you really want is this phase, the engage, where you're giving frequent feedback, but in a language that they understand. Not too much, so you don't frazzle them, but enough so they stay engaged. So if you want to get your stakeholders engaged, don't frazzle them, don't get them jaded, make sure they have the right communication at the right pitch in their language. This is a Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Now there's a story behind this aeroplane. This was the first aeroplane I made when I was 8 years old. One of my friends, who was, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years old, gave me this plane as a birthday present, and we started to build it together. So we put it together with the glue and all that. We started putting bits together. Then he went home. Said we'd finish it the following day. So I continued, obviously, and I put it together with the glue, lots of glue. And I'll put some more glue just to make sure. Does anyone made model aeroplanes? Yeah, so you know what happens when you put lots of glue? And I put the bits more or less in the right places. Landing gear was a bit of a tricky bit, but the wheels are on the wings, that's what counts. They're on the top of the wings, not the bottom, but anyway, so I was really proud of my plane, but actually in objective standards it was a mess. It was a bit of a disaster. There was glue everywhere, the bits were glued on in the wrong places and all, and it was not presentable. So I basically ruined the model. So what I'd done there is I'd started the detailed work way too early without engaging in the other with the other team members. And I see this happening in BDD as well. When teams start with BDD, often what happens is the BAs take to BDD like a kid takes to a new video game. And will really get stuck into it and go to great detail and produce stuff like this. Real example, guys. Can everyone read that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can anyone understand it?
No.
Do I want to?
No, you don't want to. This is a real example. We have things like scenario, customer profile field, gender. When I'm logged into the application and I display the customer, when I view the customer profile, then I should see the gender field. Field type drop down, read only information.
That's some field business value.
We get things like this. This is what happens when BAs basically write traditional specification documents in a given when-then form. It's all Dan's fault.
I never endorsed any of the plain text stuff. That doesn't happen. Output. And do it.
So, what I try and tell teams that get into this place is that it's all very well to try and understand the requirements up front, and that's a good thing. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower, the general who organised the invasions of Europe in 1944, knew something about organising large projects. He was prone to say that plans are useless, planning is everything. Along those lines. And the reason he said that was that the plan that you produce will not survive contact with the enemy. On the other hand, the process of doing the planning, that gives you an understanding of the options that you have and the eventualities that may happen and the problems that you're trying to solve. And that's what you're really trying to achieve by planning, not the plan. The plan's rubbish, forget the plan. That is the plan. You don't need the plan. You want the planning, you want the understanding. Some of the understanding you can get by talking to business. Talking to business. Some of the understanding you will get by talking to other people in the team. You have to find that balance. But it's the planning, the understanding, the shared understanding which gives you your value, not the actual document. And that's something that's quite hard for people coming from a traditional environment to take on board, I find. So, when you come across methods, things like feature mapping, story mapping, example mapping, and so forth, all of these techniques, impact mapping as well, all of these techniques, the X mappings, I just invented that term, all about this idea of collaboratively basically, when I say planning, it's in a very general sense, but collaboratively discovering requirements and discovering what you need as a team or together, as opposed to trying to do it by yourself. Now, there is some work that BAs will have to do by themselves, otherwise you get a waste of time, because BAs will come into a 3 Amigo session and the developers will be asking them questions and they'll say, I don't know, I didn't think of that. I'll have to go and ask. If you get that situation, then maybe the BA has to do a bit more thinking beforehand. But if you're not in that situation, then collaborative planning really is the way to go. I once went to a telecommunication company in Sydney and to help them out with their test automation, as it turns out. And I asked the test manager, okay, so you have test plans for your manual tests? Oh yes, we have test plans. They're in this folder over here. Okay, so do you share them with the developers so they can check that they actually build? Oh no, we wouldn't do that, so that would spoil the surprise. They might pass the exam that way out. So, you don't get that case systematically. You don't have to be that extreme to basically sabotage what a tester can bring to the table. Testers have huge value, and the value that they can bring to the development process should be brought much, much earlier than it usually is in most organisations I see. Often what happens in organisations that start with BDD is I'll go into an organisation, I'll say, yeah, you're doing BDD? They'll say, yeah, we're doing BDD. Here, look at our BDD scripts.
Have you heard people say, look at our BDDs?
Yeah.
God, yes.
Does that bother you as much as it bothers me?
It does. We also have the GWTs.
Oh God.
So we have the BDDs and the GWTs as proof of whether we're doing BDD. And here are some GWTs with some BDDs. So here my BDDs express clearly the requirement that I'm trying to implement, as you can clearly see. Now this is a real example from a transport organisation in New South Wales that shall remain nameless. This is actually fairly typical of what you see when testers start doing BDD and thinking, oh, this looks like a cool scripting tool, and so they'll take Cucumber or Behat or SpecFlow and start writing test scripts, and you end up with this sort of stuff, which is totally useless from a common understanding point of view. And also pretty useless from a testing point of view, because it turns out that Cucumber and tools like this are pretty rubbish at test automation. You use them as test automation, but that's not their main value add. If you just want to do test automation after the fact, just do a normal unit testing tool and write a fluid DSL. That'll do the job fine. It'll be much easier to maintain. Only use a tool like this, BDD tool, if you're actually getting communication, and even then it's optional. Just for the story, we refactored this particular scenario into something like this. By the way, I didn't mention at the start, but if you want to ask any, I know Anthony's got the idea, but if you want to ask any questions, just ask whenever it occurs to you, otherwise you'll forget by the end and we'll lose the benefit of the conversation. So if we move into the what section, what is about building the right software? What are you building? And one thing that I often see in organisations is when you come up with a requirement, the stakeholder may know why they need this requirement. Maybe the BA knows. After that, it's a lot more fuzzy. Yeah? And we get these requirements like this one. So for those of you in the back, we have, as a user, I want to view the customer profile details so that I can see the personal information on the customer. How's that sound, people? Can people see that there is no clear reason why I want to see the customer information. What's so special? What does it bring me to see the customer information? Why? How does it help me? So, in BDD school, often what we try and do is flip it round so that we're talking about the goal as a priority. We'll say something like, in order to propose more relevant services to my customer, as a financial advisor, if you ever see as a user, forget as a user. As a user is a useless line. You can forget as a user, ditch as a user. As a user does not exist. Yeah? Got that? Do a search replace of as a user with rubbish. So as a user doesn't bring you any information. As a financial advisor, yeah, that might give me a bit more context. I want to access relevant customer profile details, there you give a bit more context. So the point of this is that the goal should always be a level of abstraction higher than the feature that you're implementing. Yeah? Often that doesn't happen. It's not as easy as it sounds. The goal often gets neglected. So this is where things like impact mapping and feature mapping and so forth help clarify why you're actually building things. If you don't have that, the information gets lost. Now this is one of my favourite ones. This particular scenario is what I see when teams start to do BDD and they get into it very enthusiastically and they attack these scenarios with passion. And they come up with scenarios like this. So if we enter a username Scott and password empty, then we get an error message. I bet you couldn't have guessed that. This will surprise you. If you forget the username, you also get an error message. And if you enter the wrong password, you'll get an error message. So, how much value is that scenario bringing to the table? How much did you learn from this?
Makes the tester happy.
Makes the tester happy, that's a really good point. We may need tests for this. Should it be in a user's menu? Dan, yes.
I just want to inject something here. This is a really useful example of the difference between BDD, like trying to figure out what you want, versus testing, or test thinking. My favourite bug report was, I've got to be 2003, like well over a decade ago, was a tester, and it was this test. Right? It was entering an invalid password, and they found they could enter an invalid password, and they also noticed that you get into long passwords, and it's supposed to be like limited to 30 characters or whatever. So being a tester, the difference between test thinking and program thinking, how long? So double it, paste it, double it, paste it, double it, up to, the bug report was, if you enter a password greater than 32,000 characters, the application crashes. So it started as a validation error, they'd found an exploit. They could crash the entire server from the password field. Right, so that is the world's worst scenario, but a really, really useful test.
Absolutely, so that's a really good point. I like to make the distinction, and totally independent of what tools we're using, the distinction between acceptance criteria that come out of the BDD process and tests, functional tests, which are totally different beasts. You tend to have a lot more, we'll see a lot more of this in examples further on, but just because it's not in the acceptance criteria that come out of your example mapping sessions or your 3 amigos doesn't mean you don't have to have a test for it. Anthony.
So just to add to that, I mean, this is a really good example of how you can kind of separate the things that we need examples for to understand the problem we're trying to solve versus stuff that we can try in an exploratory fashion separately to that, to see if there are things we haven't thought of yet, like finding an exploit. Now, I wouldn't want to have that as an example,
No.
but I might try that just to see what happens.
You're an evil tester, which is why I hired you.
Yeah, I might try that just as a way of looking for an exploit, but I'm not going to say you must write that down here. So I just think that was a really nice kind of separation between the examples we might need to understand the problem we're solving versus the things we might try to see if that enables something we didn't want to happen.
And that's something that I find testers need a lot of reassurance about, because the reflex of your tester will be that I need edge cases and I need all of these scenarios, and I'll have a table, we'll have some examples later on of tables with 20 scenarios. I've got several examples, and they are not meaningful from an example point of view. My rule of thumb is, would it go in a user's manual? Would you put the 32,000 character password in the user manual? As an example of, oh yeah, by the way, don't enter this password.
Well, the thing is, that's clearly a bug, right? There's validation that should have been checking the password field. Rather than saying you're not checking it, it's like, how much aren't you checking it? and that's the difference between tester thinking and developer thinking.
Absolutely, yeah. So, moving, that's a good segue, because my next scenario is what I call, my next antipath is what I call scenario overload. And it's when you get a very tester feel to the scenarios. Things like this, another real example. And can anyone look at this at a glance and see what it's actually doing? Okay, you've had 10 seconds. This has failed its test. What it's actually doing is updating the billing code. So here is a typical classical difference between the what and the how. This stuff at the top is the how. How are we doing something? If you show the how, you won't understand well, our brains cannot focus at multiple levels of abstraction at the same time. If you're looking at the grass, you can't see the trees. If you're looking at the how, the steps, you won't be thinking about what you're trying to achieve. You'll be focusing on how you're trying to achieve it. And this leads to some classic BDD failures. What I've seen, one example, I was working with a bank in Sydney, and I was mentoring them on BDD practices. I came back to see how they were doing, and they said, okay, well, we had a bit of a failure in the last sprint because we did the 3 megos, we did the scenarios, we had our they didn't call them BDDs. We had our scenarios. They were all validated by the stakeholder. We went to the sprint demo and they said, did you calculate this value? Oh, bugger, we forgot that. That was actually the value that the story was supposed to produce. That was the goal of the story, to produce this particular value. They'd forgotten it because their scenarios were so focused on this, clicking here, selecting this, going from this screen to this screen, and the client was happy with that. Screens looked awesome. That actually, even the client had actually forgotten what the story was supposed to achieve, because it's very difficult to see what isn't there. It's very difficult to, if you're showing someone steps and fields in a screen, they will say those fields look fine. If you're not saying, is this the business value, is this the flow that you're supposed to achieve, is this the business value you're supposed to be getting, they won't agree or disagree on that. They'll just say, yep, the fields look fine. So, and it's a very, very common trap scenario. I see heaps of teams that fall into the habit of doing UI-centric scenarios, and it becomes a real mess that's very dangerous. But you can also have other types of information overload, scenario overload, like this one. I'm sorry, all my examples are banking examples. It's nothing to do with banks, it's just that I work with a lot of banks. Lovely example here. Can you see what financial product we're trying to demonstrate? No. Would you, if you were selling this financial product to your customers, would you present it in this way? Probably not. Yep, that's a bonus saver account. Got that far. So we can do things, but if often what I find is if you have too much information hides the message. We can do things like represent information in the form of a table. That'll work sometimes, and sometimes it won't. Yes.
Just go back a slide. Can you just elaborate on your rule column, please?
Thank you. What I've got here is that in this particular example, what they did was have a list of examples of significant values, but as a developer, this list is, I'm going to have a hard time figuring out what the actual rule is. I need to know what the rule is in addition to the example. So this is in example mapping, we talk about rules and examples, not just examples. So what we do is we give the rule, the map corresponds to a particular example. Each example has a rule to describe what it's doing. It's all about communication. It's all about describe. There's nothing that says you can't have free text to say what you're doing. This is living documentation. You put whatever the hell you like in there, as long as it communicates what you're trying to communicate. So, in this example, they didn't put that there. This is the one that the testers got to. And they said, oh, we need some edge cases. So they put in all the edge cases, and you suddenly, even if you had the examples, you lose the value of what this financial product does. Good test case, not a good requirement. So again, the difference between test cases and requirements. And I'm not saying you don't want to test that stuff, you just want to make a distinction between what you need to define at a requirements level and what you need to think about when you're doing the more extensive testing. Here's another example. Another classic error with BDD beginners. This, I remember Chris Matt said a long time ago, and he pointed out in one of his talks that the value of any system is not in the inputs, it's in the outputs. Yeah? There is never any value in seeing a search criteria on a field. That's got absolutely no business value. Yeah? Crazy talk? Or common sense?
Makes sense.
The search criteria has no value in itself. The value is what you find with the search criteria. The search criteria is only useful, the search fields are only useful if they help you find information that you're looking for. You could search by favourite pet. It's not going to be very useful to you most of the time, depending on your application. So moving on to the how. This is a more technical, more implementation-focused anti-patterns. The first one is the one I was referring to earlier with the screens. You don't want to scenarios which talk about UI implementation. Once you delve into implementation, you lock yourself into a path that you cannot deviate from. Yeah? So like the dark side of the force. Once you describe UI in your scenarios, people will not think about whether there is any value in the scenario. They'll think about whether the UI is interesting or not. Because it's a different level of abstraction. I'm not saying you don't need to think about the UI. Sure, you need to think about UI. But scenarios are not a good place for that. Wireframes, mock-ups are a much better place. Scenarios, not so much. Here's another example where we have enter Scott into the username and so forth, click on login. As soon as you have enters and clicks in the given when thens, that's another bit of a bad sign. You want to take a step back and try and figure out what you're trying to achieve and what the real outcome is. Again, here we've got the application homepage should open. That's not really a business outcome. Our real business outcome would be to provide access to the accounts. Another anti-pattern that I see quite a lot of when testers start to do BDD is everything is done through the UI. Now, there's nothing wrong with a good UI test, but you want to know why you're testing the UI. Testing the UI because you want to exercise the UI. There's a lot of stuff that you don't need to test through the UI. Setting up test data, you shouldn't be going through the UI typically. Validating outcomes, often you can query a back-end service rather than go to the UI. A lot of logic doesn't need to be done through the UI. It's a reflex to test everything through the UI, which is not very productive. That's just because it takes longer, the tests take longer to run. If the UI tests were instantaneous and highly reliable, I probably wouldn't fuss about it so much. Another interesting aspect relates to what we were talking about earlier on with how you pitch your documentation, how you pitch your communication. Who are you communicating to? Who are your tests? Who are your scenarios aimed at? And now this is an interesting one. Typically your acceptance criteria are aimed at basically everyone, stakeholders included. But you can do BDD for unit tests still. Won't use Cucumber or BHAT, but you can use a BDD style writing for the unit tests. But your language may be a little bit more focused on developers, and maybe talking to other developers or your future self in a month's time when you try and figure out what you were going on about when you wrote that code. That's why I do write unit tests, because I can never remember what I wrote a week afterwards. So I have to jot down my thought process in the form of tests. And I call them executable specifications. And I find it works really well. And it turns out it's actually a really good technical documentation approach at a unit testing level. But at the acceptance testing level, what often happens is you'll have tests slipping in. This is an example. I found this in a test space, and I asked what it was, and the tester said, well, test manager told me to put it there. This was after the 3 amigos. And so we sort of had to look at it and work through it and figured out that there was actually a business value, a business reason behind it. It was basically about showing the location of the user connecting to the system by default or something along those lines. Well, you couldn't guess that from this scenario.
John, can you read it out a bit? Because the font's really small, it's quite hard to see. It takes 2 seconds to read.
Fair enough. So it is this one is, given I am an authorised staff member, when I log on using my valid credentials, then the following branches should be available in the branch drop-down. George Street, Market Street, Liverpool Street. There you go. So now you have a total understanding of that requirement, yeah? Every user in the system has George Street, Market Street, and Liverpool Street. So the test is actually wrong as well. Let's test it. Sorry?
So I could come here and say, this is a bit of C#, that one of my development roles. Can you always wrong about it? Like, is it, you see what I'm trying to say? So I'm kind of playing devil's advocate and saying, keep on bringing bad examples using my tests.
I take your point.
Yeah, see what I mean?
I take your point. If you're receiving that, that's probably the impression I'm giving.
It was a bad example that was written by someone in the team.
I will give you a counterexample. I'm not saying that testers write bad BDD scenarios. I'm saying that if you let testers use testing practices to write BDD scenarios, you will get counterproductive, or you will not get the full benefits. Traditional testers, yes. What I see, on the other hand, is that testers can be brought on board quite quickly and very efficiently. And there's no reason why you can't write functional tests as well as your acceptance criteria. No one says you can't. It's just that you want to make that distinction between your tests which communicate the requirements, the acceptance criteria, and the tests which test all your edge cases, which tend to be a different set of tests. If you communicate all of the edge criterias as part of your living documentation to the whole team, it ends up being too much information. It will overwhelm the team. If you just communicate the status of the project using a set of selected examples, it gives a much better picture of what the application can do. Then you can drill into the details if you want. So I'm not having a go at testers. Had a go at BAs earlier on as well. I have a go at everyone with equal measure. Here's another example of, it's actually an open question. Here we have, this is a real world example. So I've been doing giving some coaching for this is actually written by a traditional tester who's coming into BDD style testing. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but we have when registering a new driver with a mobile number. So this is sort of it's kind of a Uber for taxis application. Anyway, so we have, assuming Alice is an administrator, Alice should be able to add a new driver successfully. Yeah? We can see the details later on, but yes, Dan?
Would it help to just say BDD style testing isn't a thing? The phrase BDD style testing, my brain's trying to process that. I get BDD, I get testing, they're very different things.
They are very different things.
The fact that I have a tool like Cucumber or StackFlow or whatever, and one of the things it does is automate other software, doesn't make it even a candidate for, or a useful candidate for testers writing automated tests. It happens to be in the building, and people happen to be using it, and we should maybe gently guide them away from that, because you're at least 2 levels of indirection from anything interested. And I've used SpecFlow, I've used Cucumber, and they are fantastic tools for a style of communication with a style of stakeholder. Right? Testers and testers automating things is an enormously useful thing. When those worlds collide, no good will come.
Yes, I agree. I like that way of
Can
doing
we
things.
just get BDD style testing? It's like, it's just making my head hurt.
Can someone tweet that?
I know, one of my favourite testers.
I am, don't put me in a box. I am many things. I'm a developer and a tester and a BA and many things.
When you're in the role of tester, you're one of my favourite testers.
When that's the hat I wear, and believe me, it is a very stylish one.
Beautifully quiet.
So what I would like to say about that actually is, I think that's an awesome topic for possibly like a panel discussion one day that could happen here. I think that's quite interesting, and I think there's testing, and testing, and I think there are many different perspectives on that. I think when people say BDD style testing, what they mean is using tools designed for BDD to automate repetitive actions involved in certain aspects of test execution.
What he says.
And I don't necessarily think that that is testing. I think that's a thing that people do. But I think that topic in itself is so big that we should probably have like some panel debate one day, maybe I'll write a blog post about it. Anyway, carry on, John.
Okay, so Constantine will slot a panel discussion around that topic. So technically it's not even BDD, it's testing using a framework that could also be used for BDD. My point here is that the top level ones could be part of your standard acceptance criteria. As you go down, we get, and there's nothing wrong with these, they're perfectly legitimate tests. Alice should be able to add a driver with a signal leading space. Alice should be able to add a driver with a double leading space. Alice should be able to add a driver with a signal leading space and a trailing leading space. Alice should be able to add a driver with a signal leading space and a signal middle space. And it goes on for about 30 examples like this. My point here is they are potentially perfectly legitimate edge cases, maybe not all of them, potentially massive cases for unit testing, but I would certainly not want to put them into a user's manual. And that's the rule of thumb. If a requirement will go into, if an example goes into a user's manual, I'd say, yeah, that's an example you'd want as an acceptance criteria. If the users don't really want to know about it, if it just should work, if it doesn't, well, obviously it's broken, then that's something you need to test, but as part of the testing process, as part of the functional tests. And you want to make a fairly clear distinction between the two. And my final anti-pattern is what happens when teams fail on that communication side of things. So we talked about there are many channels of communication. You want to be able to communicate in terms of working software. You want to show what's being done. You want to do demos. You also want to give a high-level view of what's going on, what's being delivered. So you want to be able to see what's happening at the requirements, not just a list of tests of the pass to the fail. You want to know what capabilities you're delivering, how well they've been implemented, which requirements have been tested, which haven't been tested, and so forth. Testers really like that for release validation. And you also want to know the details. How does it actually work? So when you say there, when I add a new driver, what does that actually entail? What steps do I go through the application? So it's not that we don't want to know that. We do want to know about it, but we don't want to specify it at the highest level of our acceptance criteria. So this sort of feedback is really important as well. So basically what I've been saying is the whole BDD adoption process is about balance. It's about finding a path between extremes in different aspects. So you don't want to be working on requirements too early. You don't want to be writing your test too late and saying it's BDD because you lose the leverage. Just to rectify the testing aspect, testers are awesome people. They have massive value to bring to a project. If you silo away that value at the end of the project, you lose most of the benefit. You want to get testers involved much earlier, and that's what BDD and the 3 amigos process and example mapping, that's what that tries to achieve. Bringing the tester activity way up front so it can actually help leverage what you're implementing and what you're not implementing much earlier on in the process, rather than saying, yep, that's broken, yep, that's broken, yep, well, could you do it this week? Nah, it's too late, we've got to deliver next week. Well, maybe we could, nah, no way, you can't do that, it's too late now. Does that ring any bells? You don't want testers to have to be in that situation. They've got a massive capability of delivering value much earlier on in the process, and you want to be able to leverage that. So, I think I don't know, do we have 1 minute for questions, or what time are we supposed to be finishing?
They let me have like 2 hours when I'm this.
All right, so we do have time for questions. And I'll let Dan and Anthony answer all the questions. Yes. Sorry, yes.
Thanks. You're using Scrum. Do you write all the BDD before the sprint starts, or during the sprint?
You mean the scenarios? The acceptance criteria? Like all good questions, the answer is it depends. I try, it's a last responsible moment thing. Typically I won't try and get all of them done before the sprint, but often I will get a good chunk of them. If you do it,
Could you have accepted criteria scenario of automated tests have been written in BDD and then have that happen during the sprint?
you want to know the acceptance criteria before you start working on them. Whether you automate that in BDD, you can do that at the same time as the developers start working on it. It really depends on how your developers work with testers and the automation. But you want the acceptance criteria. The idea is to understand the acceptance criteria before you start working on the application. Then, how you automate it, that will depend on your team dynamics. Some teams like to automate it completely up front and have a pending test before they start any development work. Some applications lend themselves to that more easily than others. Others will do the automation at the same time. You don't want to do the automation totally after the development, or definitely not in the following sprint, because then you start to get, you'll drain on your flow, your throughput, but you can do it at the same time.
I would suggest that if you're doing something really highly uncertain, like you're working for a tiny startup, or you're doing something that's totally new and it's still massively in flux, don't try and automate it. Get an understanding of it first. Automate when you have the understanding.
So that's a really good point. Don't automate until you have the understanding. The understanding is the most important thing. The understanding is what you're trying to get out of the collaboration, not the automation. The automation is the sugar on the cake. Yes.
Sorry, about testing, so I know it's a bit sensitive now, but...
It shouldn't be. I apologise if I've insulted any testers beyond repair.
So, it's about like automation. So if we capture the requirements in a BDD manner and write our scenarios and everything, and now we want to automate them. In our organization, we do that. So we write the scenarios in a way so that the automation testers can take them directly, and they do a bit of tweaking and then automate them. And now we've got a debate going on at the moment whether that version is actually presentable to the client. Luckily, our client is quite technical, so they do understand, but we understand that it's not really helpful when the things go to like other stakeholders, like very business-focused stakeholders. So how do you see these things? So should we have one version of scenarios that we write for the business people and everybody else to understand the requirements and everything? And when we go about automating them, so should we actually have another version which is much more technical and implementation focused?
That's a good question. So the value of your automated scenarios is the feedback, and getting the feedback to the business is important. And the feedback is valuable if you're demonstrating the application does what it does. When you're looking at more technical implementations, it's sounding like it's more integration testing almost. It could be more, or the other aspect of it is that your scenarios expressed at a business level hide a whole lot of stuff under the hood, which is fine. And then it gets technical under the hood. You want to hide that abstraction, hide that complexity as much as possible in your business-facing scenarios. You can have more technical scenarios, which I would prefer to you implement directly as integration tests. But my business-focused ones, my business-facing scenarios, I'd rather them stay in a business language and then do what I need to do to hide the complexity underneath.
So essentially we have two versions, one for two different audiences. Like for the business people, we have one version which is much more focused on the business and on the integration test or any other level of testing.
I don't know whether I call it two versions. I'd say that you would have an acceptance criteria that is business facing, and from that you may have other tests which flow, which are more technical, but your acceptance criteria that's business facing is a fully fledged test that exercises the application and demonstrates what it does. But an example with some banking clients where they do file transfers, they may want to know that a certain type of transaction file is processed correctly, and then in the details you may want to know that if you have certain limits on certain values in the fields, that it gets processed in a particular way.
That feeds into lots of other types of non-functional requirements as well. So the business might have an idea that they page to load within a certain time, or that they want the database to be consistent within a certain time frame. But that doesn't necessarily have to be captured in the top level scenarios. That could be something that's separate in an integration test.
So I'm a bit confused. When you say top level scenarios or
So
acceptance criteria, are you talking about specific scenarios? Or is just the acceptance criteria as like this should happen, this should happen, this should happen, like in a business plain English language text? Or you're talking about like in a Gherkin style, like when this happens, then probably in a high level.
I tend to think of examples as examples, so it can be one-liners, and then how I implement them as given when then is my choice. I may implement it in Gherkin, I may implement it in JUnit, I may choose to implement it in some other way, but what I'm really interested in is the examples that illustrate the case, and some of them will be suitable for the business. Others that we're discussing when we talk, we may have a developer say yes, but you want to make sure that this happens in this error condition. They may be more integration facing.
It might be, so you've got the, are we solving the business problem, and then are we solving the business problem in the most effective way? Does that make sense? So like we can put things into the database, but is that the right way to do it? And so your non-functional requirements, we can display the page, but is it slow? Yeah. So your acceptance criteria, the sort of behaviour-driven stuff is about am I building the right product, and then your integration tests, your unit tests are about am I building the product right.
All right.
I think Dan had something to say as well.
Yeah, I just want to unpack the term acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria is about acceptability, and then your next obvious question is to whom? Right, so any acceptance criteria starts with a person, a stakeholder, and I think we've got this sort of false dichotomy of like tech in the business, or non-functional and functional, and really it's just a bunch of different stakeholders. And so very explicitly in the definition of BDD, which someone beat me up until I produced, is the idea of multiple stakeholders. So any acceptance criteria is acceptable to someone. So when I'm looking at your data file that came through with all the deals in, and I've got to figure out which ones are valid and which ones aren't valid, to whom? Right? It might be acceptance criteria for an auditor. Well, I need to know which of those deals didn't get settled because there's an audit requirement. It may be a legal regulatory thing. It may be a data cleansing thing, and I'm the poor bugger that's there till 3 o'clock in the morning fixing all the deals. It may be network operations. So there's a bunch of different stakeholders, and any acceptance criteria starts with, for this person, these things make this system acceptable. So things like downstream supportability, the ops people, monitoring, alerting, all that kind of stuff is acceptance criteria. Functional correctness, that's about some end user whose day job is interacting with the system. There may be a bunch of economic acceptance criteria, right, which is there's some project sponsor who's on the hook for making sure this makes a bunch of money. So before you talk about acceptance criteria, my question 0 is to whom? Because now I know the stakeholder I need to go and have a conversation with that says, oh, I'm a security person. So it's acceptable once it fulfills these criteria. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection, blah, 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 penetration testing. There's a whole bunch of acceptance criteria. It hadn't even occurred to me because I'm not a security person. And so when we talk about understanding the acceptability of something, if you start with to whom, there's a whole bunch of those people you could probably group up and call the business. There's probably a whole bunch of other people you could call operations, so security, compliance, all of those guys. And then there's the upstream guys, the next lot of developers who are going to come in and work on this. There's acceptance criteria there, and maybe documentation or test coverage or some other stuff that makes me feel safe to go and do work in that system. So that's where I'd start, is understanding to whom is it acceptable. And that gives you the frame of reference then to talk to acceptance criteria.
And then go, can you give me an example?
Yeah, because they're the guys with the examples.
Anthony?
Yeah, I wanted to chip in on that. I've been trying not to. I think what I liked about what you just said there is the who. Who's it for? Who acceptable to who?
Anthony, would you mind standing up and actually just talking? Because I can't hear you over here.
Projector, can you give me the mic?
No.
Now I feel bad. But I do like the attention. Not really. So, I liked what you said about who, acceptable to who, and that's, to me, is when it starts to suggest, are we talking about acceptance criteria for this story, or are we talking about a story for some other stakeholder? And to me, the acceptance criteria and the scenario.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's like, so somebody I know said something like along the lines of, you know, BDD is a bunch of lessons they had to learn the hard way about TDD, and then they tried to explain those lessons they had to learn the hard way in a new form. I don't know.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And one of the lessons that I learned back in the day when I first started working with XP back in 2000 was that nobody talks really about like the distinction between acceptance criteria and customer tests as we called them back then. It was just, this is the story, and here's how we know when it's done, when these acceptance tests are passing, or these customer tests are passing. So what I noticed happen over sort of the 2000s, as more and more people who are familiar with UML and various other stuff, you know, like use cases, suddenly this acceptance criteria became a distinction from acceptance tests and acceptance criteria, and that to me was a bit weird, and I was like, well, what do I do with this? And I think when people talk about acceptance criteria as a separate thing to acceptance tests, it might be that they've got these two things that are in conflict with each other. And actually the scenarios can be the acceptance criteria. So you can say, this story's done when John the, I don't know, give me a persona, John the...
Janitor.
Johnny Janitor can, and then highlight the bullet points of the scenarios. The story's done when John the Jolly Janitor can this, and this. And then maybe you can say, this story is done when Jan, the dodgy janitor or hacker, cannot do this and this and this and this and this. And suddenly the scenarios become the acceptance criteria, and you don't have to have a distinction between the two. And it just feels to me like if we have to start having separate who's for acceptance criteria, if we're attaching that to a story, maybe that's a different story.
It often is. It's certainly a different slice to it. And I would say with XP, right, and all of these agile methods, don't forget, back in the 2000s, were all team scale methods. Right, XP started at Chrysler. You had some of the best programmers. If you got Kent Beck, Ward Cunningham, Ron Jeffries, Martin Fowler, you could do anything you like. You're probably going to ship something half decent, right? But they had then so this is the Chrysler C3 project, they had a domain expert who utterly knew everything about how finance worked at Chrysler embedded in the team. Yep. She was all of the users, right? And so what it does is all of that acceptance criteria collapses into the same space. So where BDD becomes useful, and it's very much second generation, it's standing on the shoulders of that stuff, is when you have, John and I have both worked in banks where you have your customer is this 50-headed, very opinionated hydra of people right across the organisation with 106 different agendas, right, all screaming for stuff. And at that point, you need to be very clear to whom this is useful and in what context.
And that's why I think maybe if you are using stories, then it's a different story.
I disagree.
No.
Separate stories.
Yeah, I'm just saying that if you have to start...
It's a separate bunch of criteria, you're absolutely right. It's a separate bunch of scenarios. And my rule of thumb is if you've got more than about 5 or 6 scenarios for a story, it's probably more than one story.
Yeah.
And you can probably group them by stakeholder and say, here's some useful value I gave you.
So an interesting point there that I find is the implicit approach that you start off with the examples and then you get the stories from the examples, not you start off with the stories and you work the examples.
Well, start off with the stakeholders and go, can you give me an example?
Yeah.
And then work out what we're doing together.
So the stories are an artifact coming from your discussion with the stakeholders producing examples, which is quite an important
It
aspect.
can go both ways, right? Like sometimes they'll tell you, here's the thing I want, and then other times they'll give you an example, and then you kind of have to try to work your way down or up from either,
It's
right?
generative, yeah. So
Yeah, and then it becomes an exchange of examples. Like when you'll say to me, "Oh, I want this thing. Like, can you give me an example?" He's like, "Yeah, for example, blah blah blah." I'm like, "Oh, if you can do that, you could do this, for example." And I'm going to give you an example, and then it could be an exchange. And I find a lot of, particularly in banks, it tends to be the business analyst saying, "Here are the examples. Here are the stories. Go implement them," and then you don't get that exchange.
I'm grinning because that's the reality I know from banks.
Hearing
Some more questions.
this example and hearing back the first question, yeah, should it be like we should have specs with scenarios written before sprints start, so that when it's presented to the team, they understand the scenarios. Based on that, they get stories and all those things. I mean, because what you're saying is this: we write scenarios which is automated. It smells like testing done by BDD later in the sprint or maybe after sprint. But the value you mentioned earlier is this: like if you have a spec with the exact scenarios, it's a collaboration tool where you understand the requirement. Because we are gone with the BRD thing, yeah. So should it be like who should write these specs? BA?
I'm sure if I say something, it's going to be misconstrued.
What did you say
Liz?
about testers?
Liz, did you have a comment?
That's what.
So
I see your-
I used to say it didn't matter as long as they had the conversations. What I found is that in new teams, particularly in traditional organisations, if you don't get the devs to write the scenarios, you won't have the conversations. So you have the conversations, the devs write down, and if all they are doing is literally transcribing what the BA has said, that's better than not having the conversations, because the number of times I have myself listened to what people are saying and then written something different on a piece of paper because I've already picked about the system, right? It's the opportunity to have feedback on the devs' understanding. So get the devs to write the scenarios. Until you are used to having those conversations, until you're used to where the feedback needs to really happen, get the devs to write the scenarios. It doesn't take that long to type 3 to 7 lines of text. And if it's more than 7, investigate that one.
But this is where one of the anti-patterns is there. Like say if you have a mature project where you have all those requirements, you have some steps which are automated. I mean, I would say implemented. Extra code, everything is there. What happens then? Project managers, they think, oh, it's just copy paste of that scenario and all that. With that, all those bad practices of not collaborating and all that, this comes into picture, and that's where we are struggling with also.
Yes, you do. Well, that
then,
would be a bad
and
practice.
then people want a code which basically create the scripts or what you say BDD scenarios, like a automated script and all that. But that's what the anti-pattern comes into picture. So do you have any suggestions for that? How we can avoid that?
Maybe we'll take it offline. shall we?
No, I'm saying like when people have scenarios, yeah, implemented, then people tend to have some script to create those scenarios.
Why?
That's what, they say, okay, same like what we have implemented last, just change the data and just, create more scenarios also.
But you want to have the conversation, so automating that is not the right thing to do.
So this is what I'm saying, so people are using for that, the second thing, but not for the collaboration.
Okay,
So I think we're running out of time, so we'll take that
I see
offline.
instances where people start talking between each other, which is an amazing thing that I want to encourage. But I think it will be easier if everybody's standing with a glass of beer and we can renew the John's beer. So, guys, I think the talk is superb and it's finished, but that is not to say that you need to go home now. Please, let's talk, let's discuss those things that we started discussing. Thank you for coming. Let's chat.